Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Cody. Cody, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
For sure. Thank you for having me on this show today. My name is Cody Morris, Dr. Cody Morris. I'm a graduate program director and assistant professor of psychology and behavior analysis at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island. I am interested broadly in a few things within the realm of behavior analysis, which is like a subfield of psychology that I'm sure we'll sort of dive into in terms of defining it. But within the realm of behavior analysis, I'm very much interested in things that improve the practice of behavior analysis as we know it. And so that includes a few things. I'm really interested in the process of clinical decision making. I'm interested in improving and modifying assessment and treatment methodologies, and I'm interested in organizational and supervision practices related to the implementation of behavior analysis. I'm also a history geek within and outside of the field. And so I do a little bit in the realm of history of behavior analysis and psychology. And other than that, I'm the director of the Rhode Island Association of Behavior Analysts. I'm on the editorial board of a journal called Behavior Analysis and Practice. And I'm the host and executive producer of a podcast called Behavior Analysis and Practice, the podcast.
A fellow podcaster. I like it
That's
already.
right. I just wrapped an episode right before we jumped on, which is why it took me a second. So this is my second podcast of the day.
Welcome to the show. Can you give everybody a breakdown on what behavior analysis is, what that entails? How do we do the scope of? I'm guessing it's just measuring somebody's behavior, but it's got to be way more complicated than that. I mean, each individual person is. I'm all over the board, like you can tell by my episodes. I'm a little hard to pin down when it comes to who is this type of person. Is it that scope, or is it something a little bit deeper?
Sure. So, sort of an interesting distinction between two things as we start. So, there's something called a behavioral analysis, and there's something called behavior analysis. So, behavior analysis is a field in a subdiscipline of psychology. So, it's sort of its own thing. And this essentially grew arguably starting with like the work of John B. Watson in the early 1900s, but really hit its stride and really grew into what it is today, starting with B.F. Skinner in the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s. Moving into like the 1990s, it's actually sort of officially, in many ways, branched off of psychology, created its own certification, its own ethics codes and regulations, and in the 2000s really started licensing professionals as behavior analysts rather than psychologists. And so, for example, I'm a licensed behavior analyst in the state of Rhode Island. I'm a certified behavior analyst. I am not a licensed psychologist, even though I teach within a psychology department. My graduate program is within the Department of Psychology. I, in fact, am not a psychologist. I am a behavior analyst. In terms of what that means, like what is a behavior analyst and sort of what is a behavioral analysis, those two sort of questions are the same in that behavior analysts fundamentally are interested in the interaction between a person's behavior, and we can sort of talk about and define what behavior is because it's much more broad than like a specific action, right? Behavior analyst would conceptualize thoughts as behavior and certainly the observable things that we do as behavior. So like we're interested in the interaction between behaviors and the environment that a person is in, right? And that could be the external environment. So if you're in a classroom setting, we were talking about sort of school related behaviors right before we hit record. If you're sitting in a classroom environment as a kid with difficulty paying attention to the lesson, what are the things in the environment that potentially can contribute to that difficulty? What are the things that can alleviate some of that difficulty? And that's just within the external environment. That's the environment that we all share and that we can all see. And then again, as a radical behaviorist or as a behavior analyst that looks at the full picture, I would also say that the individual's private environment or our internal state also affects our behavior, right? So, the easiest way to talk about this is if you have, back pain or something like that, as people in your environment, I can look around and I can't really see what you're experiencing, but nevertheless, that back pain obviously affects your behavior, the way you walk, the way you move, potentially your energy levels, etc. And so, in a nutshell, to throw a lot at you, that's sort of what behavior analysis is. We care about behavior environment interactions, and we sort of define those in very particular ways.
What strides have we made in just the sense of the environment and someone's behavior? For my example, will be ADHD. The number of noise around me makes it extremely difficult to stay focused. I was an F student, but obviously you could tell by how many academics I talk to. I'm not that dumb. I'm kind of intelligent in a sense. At least I grasp, listening pretty well. But I had one teacher that was on my show. I think it was episode 10 or 11, who noticed I just wasn't paying attention. They just let me run a little bit more at recess. And that extra energy push going out helped me sit down and focus instead of sharpening my pencil 100 times until there was nothing left. I mean, it's those small little things, but it's recognizable. I mean, a kid with ADHD, it's hard for them to sit still in a classroom for a couple hours. ADD, it's hard for a kid to pay attention when there's a clock ticking, a fish tank in the room. I mean, simple things, but it's easy to detect those in my, I guess, case compared to a private home situation. That's really hard to address. I mean, it's hard to get a kid to open up about home issues. And I think when I was just getting out of school, they were starting to do that a little bit more. It seemed like not psychologists, guidance counselors were trying to like question more. I think this was the time when like there was abuse at home, but in like the bad sense, not like beating, but sexual stuff. And that's when guidance counselors were openly asking the question about that because they were concerned. And I remember my dad going, I was like, what did you say to them? And I was like, I didn't say anything. They're just checking everybody. And but it's a real thing. And it's that's a lot harder to diagnose than it would be to with a kid with ADHD in just a noisy environment.
Yeah, so a lot of great points you make in that, and a lot to sort of digest and to sort of talk about. So, in terms of looking at any given behavior or struggle, let's just keep this again in sort of a public school setting, right? So, you've got a student, you're a teacher, oh, you have a student in your class that isn't completing the assignments. Some people, some disciplines, some professionals might jump straight to that kid's got to have ADHD. Therefore, let's go ahead and most often, in many cases, let's throw some medication at that issue, right? Not to say that that's not the right avenue.
Shouldn't be the first.
From a behavior analyst perspective, probably shouldn't be the first. So if I'm in that situation, teacher asked me to come in, I've got a student who's not completing work. My question is, looking at that individual student and going, well, what is sort of the root cause of that? Is it that they keep losing attention? Like I can see them, I can watch them looking at their assignment, but then they're doing, they're looking around the room, they're fidgeting, they're doing whatever, and they keep like, and then they'll go back to it, and then they lose attention. Like, okay, those are a little bit more strong indicators that we may have a attention deficit, right? As opposed to a student who maybe never looks at it or whatever it may be. I look for specific indices of what the actual issue is. It could be that they don't know how to do the assignment and that they're covering it up with other behaviors, right? So it's not uncommon to have a student who maybe has a learning difficulty, let's say on math, right? And they're not so great at math. Instead of saying like, "Hey, I can't do this," or completing it incorrectly, they'll act out in class so that they don't essentially have to ever acknowledge that they from their perspective, they don't want to look like they're stupid in front of their classmates or to the teacher, right? And so they do all these behaviors to avoid showing that they're not good at math, right?
Deflecting.
Exactly. And so my job is to ultimately figure out what's going on there. What is the actual skill deficit that we see? Could be an inattention, could be academic, whatever it might be. Then figure out how I can help that person overcome that deficit. And when I do that, typically what we do is we build in supports, we adapt the environment in a way to support that individual initially. So let's say that we've got a student who has difficulty staying focused and interacting with assignments for prolonged periods of time, right? So some strategies that might be used depending on their particular needs. Like you said, getting a lot of proactive exercise in, right? So they come in and their body's physiologically ready to like stay seated for a little while. It might be breaking up that assignment. So if that assignment's 30 minutes, maybe we do 5-minute chunks and then I help them build that out over time. Whatever it might be, I'm going to put in some environmental modifications to help them get through the day. And then I'm going to help them learn the skills necessary to operate in a more and more independent arrangement. So instead of just going, hey, this kid's got ADHD, let's just have them work for in chunks of 3 minutes and we'll just leave that in place indefinitely. Well, that's not going to serve the kid very well when they're an adult because no workplace is going to say, hey, you can have a break every 3 minutes. That's not the way the world works, right? So I want to help that individual in the moment, but I also need to help them work out of those supports, right? In the same way that if you break your ankle, sure, I'm going to put a cast on your ankle, but I'm not going to leave that cast on indefinitely. Otherwise, you're going to get muscle atrophy and cause all sorts of other issues down the road. So yeah, I mean that's what the focus is with behavior analysis and looking at those things. One of the things we're very careful of within behavior analysis is being very sort of hesitant around pathologizing any given behavior and labeling it with something. So, for example, we've talked a lot about sort of the ADHD diagnosis. Fundamentally, diagnoses are supposed to inform treatment. That's the purpose of a diagnosis, right? And so, if we look at like physical medicine, if you have someone who's diagnosed with a specific type of cancer, the utility in diagnosing them with that is that it informs that oncology team how to treat them, right? If you have leukemia versus lung cancer, it's going to be two different treatment regimens and the degree and the stage and all that stuff that's going to inform how that team is going to treat you. You look at something like ADHD and you were to bring in a panel of psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors and behavior analysts, and let's say you had multiple individuals, multiple behavior analysts, multiple psychologists, multiple counselors, multiple psychiatrists, there's a chance that every single person on that panel is going to tell you to treat that issue in a completely different way. The actual diagnosis of ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or depression or OCD, whatever it might be, does not necessarily have agreed upon absolute best practices. This is what you do. And the reason being is that most of those diagnoses are umbrella terms. If you look at something like autism spectrum disorder, for example, which is one of the primary sort of diagnoses that behavior analysts end up working with, there are completely vast differences. It's a spectrum, but there are completely vast differences on the range of that spectrum, right? I've heard, I don't know if this is true and I don't know if this has been verified, but I've heard Bill Gates potentially meeting the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And there are individuals that I've worked with who have absolutely no way to communicate. They don't speak. They potentially don't have the ability to understand most things that are said to them, if anything, and they're in a complete sort of high need need a caregiver at all times sort of situation, can't bathe themselves, can't use the restroom themselves, can't get themselves ready, anything like that. So if I said, cool, this individual is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and one of them's Bill Gates and one of them is in an extremely high need situation, that doesn't tell me anything about how I'm going to help this person in any way whatsoever. Um, so it complicates things. And so as a behavior analyst, I do care about diagnoses. It is part of the equation, but I don't look at a diagnosis and go, therefore I do this treatment. I go, okay, this is part of the puzzle. I need a lot more information. That way I can actually truly inform and sculpt my treatment to fit this individual's needs.
So it's just more individualized care, which I think is important. I mean, I get the workload a teacher has. A teacher shouldn't have upwards to 40 students a class and then being able to teach. That's a lot. And I get it's very hard for a teacher to be able to sit down and do what my third grade teacher did, where it was just go run outside more when you notice these things. And she also gets involved into people's personal lives and understands the family situations. That's difficult for any teacher to do, especially for years and years and years of teachers teaching 10 years. I couldn't imagine teaching a class and then another class, and the next year, a whole new bunch of students. It's like, well, I got to restart from scratch all over again. But when I talked to Peter Timms on this show, he studies ADHD. And one of the things that I brought up to him, which is something that he noticed while researching into it, was the social isolation aspect. And that is considered, was when I was in school, a form of treatment for the ADHD problem. Was it would just be easier to separate this person from the class, a little bit of isolation, which is how it was always for me. But it was also the same treatment because they also, at this point, when I was a kid in school, they classified ADHD as being mentally challenged, and you would just get put in a room. There was no, and I wasn't, but it was just that disruptive aspect, those outbursts, those things that categorizes that. So you might as well treat it as that. And then obviously we've evolved from there and we've looked deeper into it, which I think is important. But I mean, we still have the same basic things in place. And maybe it's, you can't really say it's a teacher being lazy. It's just very, very difficult to be able to focus, like you're talking about, into one student and being able to pick those things clean. I think that's a great way to do that. But how do we implement that more? Keep that on teachers' basis. I mean, every day. I mean, they got their people. Half my friends are teachers. So it's like I know what they do in their free time. So it's like I get it. They have other things on their mind, but it's like that's a crucial step, especially if you're talking about elementary school. I mean, that's like that'll break or make your foundation if you're actually going to pay attention for the rest of your, I guess, education career.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the amount of work that teachers have and the amount that they have to balance, right? Because not only do they need to sort of keep a classroom of children, right? And the size can vary, right? Maybe up to 40 students, 50 students in some settings. Not only do they have to keep them engaged and paying attention, but they also have to keep them focused on specific learning outcomes that they have, right? So they're trying to not just keep these students engaged in a class, but they're trying to actually help them learn a skill that is going to be built on in the rest of their education and hopefully set them up for a successful life. So, in terms of, a classroom teacher experiencing whatever might be challenging behaviors, difficulties in their classroom, there are a few sort of best practice or what I would call sort of foundational practices for classroom teachers that would help them reduce the likelihood that they need to do these like individualized treatments, right? So you can almost think about this in a pyramid, and there are like published approaches like something called uh, PBIS, which stands for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. And they conceptualize most difficulties in a classroom, issues or behaviors that a student's going to engage in. Most of them can be addressed and prevented by high quality instruction and specifically the way that the teacher is presenting instruction in a classroom. And I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but let's say just for the sake of the conversation that something like 75% of issues in a classroom would actually be alleviated with just high quality instructional strategies. there's going to be another percent on top of that that need sort of customized, individualized strategies, but these are like sort of blanket strategies. So it might be that a kid uses something like those. I don't know if you've seen them, if you've been in a school in the last, like, I suppose, maybe 10 years, but there's like the wobbly chairs. They're like a chair with a ball on the bottom, and so the kid kind of has to like
Like a
use their
medicine ball?
course. It's like a medicine ball, but there's an actual seat on top of it. It's like the bottom is a medicine ball essentially, but it's often they're often used for kids with ADHD because they're like kind of wiggling around in their chair a little bit, but they kind of have the leeway to be able to do it. When I was a kid in school, we just rocked in our chair and leaned back and did all that stuff. Not super safe, so the wobbly chairs are probably much better for that. Or that there's other sort of baseline strategies or basic strategies they might use, and that's gonna help another percentage of students. And then there's going to be a very small percent, under 10% ish, that have extremely high levels of needs that really need a thorough assessment and very specific intervention plan targeting their particular needs. And that's sort of where my specialty focuses in. So if I go into a classroom, if I get asked to consult in a classroom, I'll go in, I'll look at sort of what their foundational practices. Sometimes I go, "Hey, you might just change this sort of approach in your instruction, and that's not only gonna help this individual student, it's gonna help everyone in your classroom." Or I might then get into very specific targeted interventions. That way the teacher doesn't have to do an individualized treatment and approach for every single one of the students in the classroom. That, if they use these strategies correctly, in a classroom, maybe only 10% of them really need individualized, very specific interventions to help them get through the day and to benefit from the instruction.
I was gonna ask about that because I wonder how many kids. I know a lot of kids have anxiety or what gets labeled as anxiety, bipolar, or some type of mental disorder that seemed to be rare when I was a kid. I mean, I was easy to point out in the classroom. You could easily tell that kid needs to go. And everyone else you don't really need rules for because they know how to pay attention. They know when to listen and write and do whatever. I just wonder what the number of that is now in classes. Do you have a lot of kids that are jumping around? I mean, obviously you'll have specific grades. That's just gonna be normal kids in kindergarten throwing stuff and eating paste or whatever. But then you get into like, third, fourth, fifth grade, and that's when it's kind of you're able to root out if this is like a continuous thing, if this is something that obviously needs to be talked about or needs to be looked at. And also I'm pretty sure classmates could address it as well too. It doesn't always have to bear weight on the teachers. I think that's been a major shift since when I was a kid. That was isolate that kid's annoying, isolate them. But now it's like kids are like, hey, he's got like, he's got something going on. He's got, kids pointed out maybe they don't do it in the best of ways, nice ways of saying it, but they alert the teacher to these things, and I think that's definitely helpful.
Well, I think that the stigma around difficulties, whether that's a specific, mental health issue or developmental disability or whatever that might be, whatever sort of label, right? So like ADHD, for example. I think in large part, the stigma around a diagnosis like that has really, really decreased in the last, well, it's been sort of on a continual decrease, but certainly in the last 10 years, where not only are teachers, I think, much more understanding of it and understanding that, like when I was in school, if you were showing symptoms of ADHD, the teachers were probably a little bit more likely to get frustrated with you, like think that it's you doing it intentionally and that maybe you're just like, a bad kid kind of a thing, right? Whereas now I think there's a lot more information out there. So the teachers are a little bit more informed. So maybe they're not, taking it personally and they understand this person's struggling, that they're not just trying to make your day difficult. I also think fellow students tend to have a little bit better of understanding of these things as well, because again, we just have so much information out in our culture that it's even trickling down to kids in schools. Whereas again, going back to my time in school, if there were kids that were very obviously behaving differently than most of the other students, they might get targeted with bullying and many other things. Now, that's not to say that bullying doesn't exist in schools today, because it absolutely does. And kids with disabilities and mental health issues disproportionately get targeted for bullying. But it seems that potentially, in my experience anyway, that it has improved in some ways. We still have so much more work to do in that area for sure. You know, there are people whose entire specialty is in this and they're doing great work. But it does seem the needle does seem to have sort of moved a little bit toward the positive in that way. And I think that's a great thing. It's great when teachers have a better understanding of the issues that are ailing folks that the fellow students do, because they can be a little bit more supportive, and you can avoid harmful interventions like isolating a kid with ADHD, right? You're like, okay, well, this kid's being a little hyperactive in class. Let's send them in there's so many different words for this, but essentially a detention room. But they'll call it the focus room or the whatever room where
Give it a
you
good name. Give it a good name, and I'll get in.
exactly. You're gonna go into this room. There's gonna be absolutely nothing in there other than a desk, probably, right? And you're gonna sit in there potentially all day, um, which is how things used to be, and I think to an extent maybe that still occurs today. But if we have a better understanding of the particular issues, we can use those, or teachers can use those strategies less and less, and hopefully get to the point where things like that aren't necessary for a student. Because you hit on an interesting point earlier. The reality is there are a lot of things influencing a teacher's behavior in any given situation. So if a teacher's got 30 kids in her classroom, and one or maybe multiple are really hyperactive and disrupting the other students, the reality is sending that kid with ADHD out of her classroom into this, detention room, focus room, is going to probably help her focus on the other students. So that can be very reinforcing. Like, yep, he's essentially out of my hair, and whether he benefits or not isn't my immediate concern. And the issue is you're essentially worsening the issue for that individual who you've then isolated and not given proper instruction to, because they're going to fall further and further behind academically. They're going to have less and less opportunities to engage in appropriate social interactions and practice those things, right? So it could be students who struggle connecting with other students for whatever reason, and potentially their hyperactivity isn't helping the situation. Well, the less and less time they spend around other students, it's going to complicate their abilities to practice those skills, build friendships, things like that. And those can have devastating effects on an individual long term.
Well, what would be, I guess, the answer here if we talk about the easy fix, which is just casting a kid out? And I'm not talking about just ADHD. We can switch it to mentally challenged. I know plenty of people that'll say, like, why don't you just give them specific attention? There were specific teachers when I was in school that had their job was take this kid who was mentally challenged on the spectrum, just and you teach him separately from everybody else. He might be able to enjoy lunch with everybody, but he won't disrupt the class. And I don't really like that style. Like, I get if it's for the benefit of the other students and stuff, but I feel like at this point it just can't be that as well. So we can't just have specific mentors. I mean, they had times where they were sitting right next to the kid in my class, but my fourth grade teacher, one of these kids had a freak out, and my fourth grade teacher just went up and the kid hit him and he hugged the kid and he held him there until he stopped flailing his arms and stopped. And he had a daughter that was the same disability, on the autism spectrum. And it was just like, you see that of a teacher stepping up and doing that when they can just as easily just call someone to go, throw them out or do whatever, just get them away from the rest of the students. Don't even have to get your hands dirty, as they would say it maybe. And you just go like, okay, so there's got to be a better way to treat this. We talk about the ADHD thing, isolate the kid, get him out of the class so the other students can learn. Parents said that. Other people's parents said, why is this kid disrupting my kid's ability to learn something? And I mean, they got a point, but we can't just do this aspect of isolating the whole time and expecting that to work, because then nobody focuses in on how we can just stop the isolation aspect and go into how do we make this situation better. Maybe instead of having kids, scream and yell and do all this type of stuff that could cause a freak out in a sense, not ADHD, but which is autism or something. You got to find ways to cope with it. Third grade teacher, like I mentioned before, played music, low, very soft music, and it was balancing in a sense. It didn't get people wound up. It was just enough that had something like ambiance in the rooms where kids could still work on something and still feel like it's a different day, like it's a special day or something. Like I said, this is third grade. This is probably not going to work for high schoolers, but it's that, like, I mean, I think around high school, you probably figure out when a kid has autism, and you probably, I guess, more kids would be willing to treat that kid a little bit better. The bully scenario thing doesn't really work for me. Like when I see that on TV and movies, when they say he's too dumb, he's deflect. I get it. It's good for a movie, but I think where we're at now in society, I think a lot of kids are more aware that like there's definitely more social backlash if you mess with a kid who might be on the spectrum or something like that, to where they won't even engage. But there's still the ability of how do we make sure that this kid doesn't just slip through the system as well too. That's with ADHD and that's with any disorder, which has just been like the easiest thing was cast him out. If he slips through, he doesn't get the information. That's not my fault. It's not my problem. It'll be his later down the road. And then now you got kids that, TikTok in the middle of Walmart. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you hit on some really good stuff there. But before I sort of jump into that, I just want to quickly clarify a term, just because people might be listening, just so they know the most recent term. So you use the term mentally challenged. It's not really used so much anymore. We probably say either developmental disabilities, depending on the particular issue. If it's if it's something specifically related to like the intellectual capacity, it'd be called like an intellectual disability. Just so that any listeners are aware of the distinctions and those things. Terms change frequently, and part of being able to figure out what people are struggling with is understanding the current terms, what they would be using, and hopefully using
Wouldn't
that.
intellectual disability be an umbrella term? Because couldn't you say ADHD would be an intellectual disability?
So ADHD would be considered a developmental disability. Developmental disability is a disability that basically is affecting someone over their development over their lifetime. And so the idea is if someone has ADHD, they essentially have it, acquire it as a child, and that's going to be something that's going to affect them over their development and over their lifetime. Intellectual disability is about specifically about the sort of intellectual prowess that an individual has. Now, sort of trigger warning here, intellectual disability would have it sort of replaced the term mental retardation. So what would have been diagnosed as sort of mental retardation years ago, we now use intellectual disability, and it's referring to a person's, again, cognitive capacity, their ability to learn, and the efficiency they're able to learn, the quickness they're able to learn, retain, etc. It's very complicated, obviously, all the factors that would go into someone's sort of intellectual capacity. But yeah, intellectual disability would be the appropriate term for something like that.
I had a conflict with a potential guest one time who talked about this, like about like 500 episodes ago, maybe. I think it was a time like it was 2 years ago. And she was like, "Yeah, you're ADHD, you're developmentally disabled." And she was treating it like I was on the spectrum, like where I had autism. She was labeling in that category. And I think she teaches in Wisconsin. And she said that's what her school does, is that they label those two together. And I was like, well, hang on a second. Like I've done a good amount of episodes and retained a lot of information. I might mess up sometimes, but you can't chalk that in the same category. But I mean, maybe it's just some schools that are different. I don't like, I guess the terms change all the time. I just want to clarify to make sure that I'm not getting like, they also said if you hear the lights or whatever, if you can hear the bulb making that buzzing noise, that's a sign that you might be mentally challenged. That's a myth, because I know like 100 people that say the same thing. I can hear it. I'm like, all right, good. I'm not
Yeah, that's definitely a myth. So what most people use to sort of label mental health issues is called the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, and we're on the fifth edition, so that what we call the
DSM.
DSM-5. Yeah,
I
and
went to school for psychology, by the way.
oh, okay, nice. So like the umbrella term for like this category overall is developmental disabilities, and again, that simply refers to something that's affecting you over your lifetime. Within that, ADHD affects you over your lifetime, right? So ADHD would technically fall under the category of developmental disabilities, as would autism spectrum disorder, as would intellectual disability. They're all distinct, but they all fall under this realm. And that's sort of, you know, to give it like a comparison, there's something called the personality disorders where you might have borderline personality disorder, you might have histrionic disorder. Like there are multiple sort of categories under these umbrellas. And so developmental disability, the reality is that in pop culture, it tends to primarily be used to refer to individuals with intellectual disability, difficulties learning, retaining, etc. But in fact, it's a much, much broader category than that. And that speaks to the complication of these diagnoses, by the way, that you have specific diagnoses that we all think means one thing, that is that may not actually reflect what in fact it truly means in terms of the actual manual itself. Like OCD is overused and completely misunderstood. You know, the amount of people who sort of are self-diagnosed with OCD because, maybe they like having things orderly. That's not actually truly reflective of that diagnosis. Or, you know, anxiety. Like the reality is we all experience anxiety at some point in our life. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have an anxiety disorder. The crux of that position or that conversation really comes down to, if you experience anxiety in such a way that it negatively impacts the quality of your life, then you very well might qualify for a specific diagnosis.
Like Michael J. Fox in Scrubs when he had OCD and he kept washing his hands for 6 hours after the surgery and he was like crying because he couldn't leave because he had to keep washing his hands. Yeah, I mean that's like migraines though. People always say I got a migraine. It's like I've talked to someone who studies migraines. You don't have a migraine. That's a different experience, but it's a term that gets used and then it ends up kind of losing meaning in a sense. I mean, the number of people I've heard that say they have anxiety or they have some type of bipolar or something like that, and they've never been diagnosed for it. And I hear people use ADHD all the time, which I'm just like, do you sleep well? And they're like, yeah, I sleep like a rock. And I'm like, then you don't have ADHD, man. Because I can tell you right now, I've lost more sleep than I could count. And I mean, I just have energy. Some people are jealous of that, and it's to me, it's you can use it as a hindrance or you can use it as a help. But I get to this point where we categorize a lot of stuff in different ways, and then people don't fully describe what those means. Like when we talk about severe mental disorders, I would classify like schizophrenia. Stuff that really affect your overall quality of life. But then I had a neuroscientist on here actually after Robert or before Robert Whitaker's episode, and he told me, well, no, that's ADHD is a severe disorder. I'm like, oh, but what scales though? Because like there's a real thing where I can still function. Obviously, I'm speaking to you, and we can go all over the board if you want, but there's a real thing where there are people that are suffering to the point where they end up like my buddy's mom shot herself. There's real hindrance and real categories we got to put stuff in, and we got to make sure that we don't just diminish the capacity of one, but also make it so far to where they're not still connected in a sense as well too. You know what I mean? Like it
Oh, for sure.
it gets hard. I
Yeah.
mean, you're asking someone to look at somebody in a class and be able to figure out what exactly is going on. Besides asking them, does a kid sometimes, the crucial steps, do they even know what's going on 100%? I didn't know I had ADHD until high school, I would say. I mean, everyone said I did for the longest time, but I never knew what the four letters together. That's all that meant. That's true. And it's like trying to get a kid to talk about that type of stuff and maybe misclassify them. And it turns out they're having a huge home issue. And that's even harder. I mean, I think checking their home is probably the best scenario when it comes to just maybe a problem that's going on, but also the environment's a big influence.
Right. Well, and all these things well, not all of them, but many of the diagnoses can easily be mistaken for one another, right? So perhaps you have a student who's like not doing assignments or is like doing part of the assignments, and you could look at that and go, yeah, ADHD, right? They're clearly losing attention and not completing the assignments.
I would have folded it up into a paper airplane.
Right. But you could also potentially have a client that is having anxiety around completing the assignment, or you could have a client or a student that has OCD that like they're so fixated on, like, having the very perfect handwriting that they can't act like, in person, they can't actually write because 'cause they'll write a P and they'll erase it, and they'll write a P and they'll erase it, and they'll just do it over and over and over because they're looking for that perfect P. Whereas you might have someone who simply has a learning difficulty, right? And they just simply don't know the content. So that's why they're not doing it. You can't look at a product and go, this is the cause. You've got to collect more information. And you refer to like check in to see what's going on at home. That's incredibly important, right? Like there's some very basic things that we know that are absolutely essential for people coming into a learning environment, right? They need to be well rested. They need to have proper nutrition, right? All of these things. If you're and I've had plenty of these clients where at home, you know, mom and dad or whoever are screaming and arguing at each other all night, or they're up doing drugs and having parties all night, whatever it might be, and the kid gets 2 hours of sleep, guess what? They're gonna come to school, they're gonna look like they've got, whatever, fill in the blank, ADHD, whatever, when in fact, it's just that their home environment is unstable. They're not getting good sleep, they're not getting good nutrition, all these things. If that were to be fixed, it wouldn't look like ADHD or anything else at all.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope though too, because if you address that or you bring in the parents to talk about that, like, hey, what's going on at home? Like, you guys partying or you guys doing? Then people take offense to that, and then it becomes a defensive situation. Where you just got to raise up the prospect, like, hey, it's your kid's future or it's your guys' night of fun. I mean, I look at kids. I work at a front desk, so it's like we get new student or not new students. We get new employees that come in, and they're like in their 20s. I'm 24, so I'm not that much older. But I tell them first 2 weeks, like just any problem that happens, don't let it consume you. Just push it on to the next person. Usually it'll be me. I'll just take care of it. And it's because you're by yourself basically. There's only one person that works the front desk and nobody else in there. So you get 150 people or something in front of you. You don't know what to do. You're rushing all over the place trying to figure everything out and you just get overwhelmed. And that's where a lot of that anxiety comes in that people talk about. You just can't let that pressure get you. But I feel like if we had better education of it in the beginning, like when we're kids and we're taught about that, like nobody really talked about ADHD and nobody talked about anxiety. Nobody talked about all these things. This is relatively, once I graduated like 6 years ago, it started becoming a little bit more known. So I'm wondering if those, I guess, assessments and those kind of things at early ages are going to help, later in life, people understand themselves a little bit more. Because I'd probably raise the argument that you have a lot of people that just are having existential crises all the time. Maybe that's just me, but they just feel lost in a sense. You got a lot of kids living, doing stuff that they would do in their 20s, but not necessarily like in the age of like buying a car, no, it's not that. It's just like you have a lot of kids that are just like they'll work or they'll leave their job. It's not, they don't feel confined to that, which I appraise. And at the same time, that's kind of scary as well, too, because, you don't want to be 40 years old and still working somewhere. I don't want to shame anybody if they're doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I hear you. I think there's a few pieces to that. On so one hand, I think it's incredibly important to clarify that there are any number of potential causes for any one behavior. So fundamentally, behavior analysts and I think other mental health professionals need to be very careful into not making any assumptions about anything given a behavior, right? Because so one of the themes and what I've been talking about so far is I can look at a child in a classroom engaging in one behavior. I cannot and should not be making any assumptions about the cause of that. It's my job to figure that out, right? So if potentially, the home setting is unstable, and I'm looking at the kid struggling in school, my job isn't to, oh, he's struggling, it's got to be a home thing. It's like, no, okay, he's struggling. Let me talk with the teacher. What are you seeing in the classroom? Let me talk with the parents. What are you seeing at home? Are they sleeping okay? Are they getting up and bother you? Get that information, and if the parents are like, "Hey, yeah, to be honest with you, we're dealing with some issues at home, they're not really sleeping well, there's been some noise and stuff." Cool. Like, that is super helpful and important, and let's kinda work together on figuring out how we can resolve that. as opposed to going, "Oh, this kid is really struggling in school, it's probably his parents' fault." It's like, no, I would never frame anything as being the parents' fault. It could be that there are factors at home that are influencing the behavior, and there's also about a million other factors that may have absolutely nothing to do with the home setting that are affecting the behavior. And I think it's the job of the person who's trying to intervene to really figure that out and to not make any assumptions, because making assumptions are dangerous. I'll give you an example. I give this to my students a lot. Switching gears outside of mental health, and just to give you an analogy, do you have a plant? Do you keep plants at home at all?
No, I don't think I could take care of a plant.
Yeah.
Thought about
I'm
getting
not
a fish, but that sounds difficult a little bit too.
I'm not a plant caretaker either, but let's see if this analogy still holds. So if you had a plant and it's on its way out, like it's looking gray, its leaves are like shriveled and stuff. Again, neither one of us really being green thumbs here. What are some possible solutions you think you can think of that might help that plant regain its health?
You pick off the dead leaves, you may change the soil maybe, change the pot if you want, if you don't like the a lot of times people when they have a plant, they just don't like the way it's maybe if they started out liking it and then they don't like it, usually it's a lot of times the appearance of it, not how the plant looks, it's necessarily the plant's environment that's in, so just change the pot. Dirt, pick off the dead leaves, you can water it, Google helps, tips and stuff like that. I think everybody at some point was a home gardener.
Yeah, so you're right? Could be the water, could be the temperature, could be the soil, could be that it's outgrown its pot, it could be pests, it could be anything. So if we were to look at a plant, just a dying plant instead sitting on someone's windowsill, I go, okay, the leaves are shriveling. It would be irresponsible of me to go, oh, it's got to be the water. I don't know that it's water. I had to figure that out, right? I've got to test the soil. Is it dry? Okay, maybe then it is water. Because if I just make the assumption, if I see a dead plant and I start putting water on it, because I just made the assumption, it's got to be water. Dead plant equals water. Start watering it. For all I know, that plant is actually overwatered to begin with. So pouring more water on it is going to exacerbate the situation. It's going to make it much, much worse. Or at the very least, I'm putting water on something that doesn't need water, and it's not that I'm gonna drown the plant necessarily, it's that I'm not actually getting to the actual solution. And so if I'm putting water on a plant, let's say that again, it's a plant that's nearly dead, I'm gonna have to water that thing for 2 weeks, right? To see if, okay, after 2 weeks, is it bouncing back at all? No? Okay, well, now I'm gonna try changing the soil. And you try all these things, it's gonna take you 3 months to figure out what's going on with your plant if you don't actually do the assessment. So instead of jumping into intervention and making assumptions about what's causing the issue, you just assess it. You poke the soil and go, "Oh, you know what? The soil's dry, or maybe the soil feels fine. I'm gonna test the pH balance or whatever it is." You figure it out. You plant what it needs. It bounces back. You look at a child who's struggling in a classroom. There are literally infinite variables and factors that can be affecting this student. So the chances of you just guessing it right, going, "Yeah, he's not doing his work," and going, "Okay, well, it's probably this." It's like playing the lottery. There's so many variables. You cannot guess. You should not be guessing. Because if you guess, you might end up contributing to the problem by adding on something like, let's say that it's like, oh, okay, we think it's ADHD, so we're going to isolate them or something. I think that can contribute to the issue. That's not going to help the issue necessarily. Or you end up just trying a bunch of things, and this kid goes through his entire, life in school and outside of school, never actually having the effective treatment, and then they wind up in their 20s. They don't have very many academic skills. They don't have skills on like persisting through a task, because you have to think about in school, the part of the benefit is like learning these academic skills that, fundamentally we all need. We all need to be able to be literate, right? We all need to be able to do basic math, etc. That's a major utility of school, but just the ability to persist in a task, right? Or to be able to receive feedback on a task. If you get a grade and it's like, "Hey, change these things," and be able to respond to that. Those are skills that any person needs if they're going to work in any sort of independent setting, right? I mean, think about people who cannot take feedback from a supervisor, appropriate feedback, going like, "Hey, you did great on these things, but this needs to change." If they can't do that, they're not going to be able to thrive in any type of employment situation.
So what go back to the checklist again. You named off 2 things, and then you went into the description about the second one.
So what checklist?
You were doing a little checklist. You went, like, I don't even think I can remember it, but I was checking them off in my head when you were saying it, and I was like, "Check, check." You're like, forget it."
Like factors that could influence the behavior, perhaps.
No, you were talking about, like, the importance of, if someone's in their 20s, and then you started labeling off a couple of
Oh,
things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I don't necessarily have an
You were like,
exhaustive
"No
list.
academic skills," and, like, not paying attention. I was like, check in my own head, check. I was like, I was classifying. I'm just bad joke, bad joke.
Yeah, no, no, I get you. No, yeah, but yeah, it's like academics, right? We need the basic stuff. We need to be able to persist. You need to have the social skills, right? You talk about the people who like homeschool kids, they're always very concerned in helping them get social skills. We get those in schools. We need to be able to get along with
My
coworkers.
cousin's homeschooled because he's a diabetic and his mom just didn't feel comfortable. He's my age, but always slow to do everything. Like when it comes to going on water park rides, like Lazy River was as far as he'd go, and I like that too, But trying to push him and get him out of that social thing. I think that's why he was like hooked onto the church so much. Was it was like a community aspect of going to church with all the little kids there and everything. Which was his mom. That was a factor of homeschool. I mean, I went to an academic school. I went to I wouldn't say I was a minority, but close to a minority. And you get involved in different cultures, and you learn stuff, and you just become, I guess, knowledgeable and more open to conversations with random people, and you treat them like they're friends. That's why I do a show that's on the basis of that. But I mean, would you say assumptions or would you say reactionary? Because as people, we are very reactionary as things. Someone dumping a water on a plant is a first reaction for a lot of people is, oh my God, I got to make up for lost time, and they dump this water on the plant. I mean, you can say the same thing with ADHD. It's not just a lazy shortcut, but it's like, how do we get this kid on the right track now? And it's like, well, we got other methods we can do as well too. It's not the only answer anymore. I mean, that was the first thing the doctors pushed for my parents to do.
I
And
think if
luckily,
you have a hammer, everything you see is a nail. If you operate in this paradigm of, you know, all these kids in school have ADHD or have whatever, then you see a issue, you see a kid who's struggling with something, you're going to make assumptions about that, right? In the same way that the reason that people might look at a dead plant, the first thing they think is water is because they're putting water on that plant every day, probably, or they should be potentially, depending on the plant. Um, they know water is associated with plants, right? That's an obvious connection. Part of the we talked about the benefit of all the information around ADHD and how people are better informed about that, and that I stand by those statements, and I think that that is absolutely true. There's also a downside, and the downside is that the more people know and think and talk about ADHD and any other diagnosis, the more they're going to see it, whether that be true or not. And so the reality is, there are going to be there's going to be probably a percentage of people who are diagnosed with ADHD that are given that diagnosis completely inaccurately, and that it's not only is it not accurate and not beneficial for them, that it could potentially be harmful for them.
it's like if you drive a Jeep and then every car you see is a Jeep.
Yeah. Or just if you're constantly talking about Jeeps and constantly being told about Jeeps, 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 when you see headlights on the road, the first thing you probably think is a Jeep. And the problem is you shouldn't see those headlights and start treating that car like it's a Jeep immediately. It'd be much more beneficial to more systematically take the time to evaluate what kind of car that is so that you can interact with it appropriately.
I think an important underlying factor, I mentioned it in the beginning, is not to put too much pressure on these teachers when they have a classroom so big. But I also think it's make sure that the teacher's first conclusion is not trying to help as fast as they can. in an aspect, they could be doing a little bit more damage, which is goes back to what you were saying, which is just like make sure you're thoroughly checking through, not just making an assumption on things, which is, I mean, it's a hard thing to do, especially if you see someone struggling. I think most people are willing to help out in that type of scenario now, but I mean, what's considered help? I mean, do you consider the kids staying after class and then getting maybe in some more home trouble or something like that? Like it's a very difficult balance and putting it on a case per case basis. I mean, what do you think about 2 teachers in a classroom?
So that's a really interesting question, and as you were sort of talking about the difficulties that teachers experience, I was already starting to come to a point here, which is teachers are given far too many responsibilities. And I don't think that's a radical opinion in any way. I think every teacher would agree, right? Because they're to the point where they are caretaking, they're in some ways functioning as a babysitter, like they're having to manage like large groups of children, right? They obviously have the academic instruction piece that like fundamentally is the primary responsibility of the teachers. They have to be sort of mini mental health professionals, right? They have to be a social worker because they have to bridge the gap between school and the family and being able to communicate with them, right?
Sometimes a
The
second parent.
second parent, right? They've got to and oftentimes are um making sure the kids are nourished, right? And then they're spending class time like eating breakfast because they don't eat breakfast at home or whatever, right? And like not to say that that's like these are necessary things. None of these are the teacher's fault whatsoever. This is what society has constructed into being the teacher's fault. And there are so many other pieces, right? But by spreading them so thin, they're being distracted from their actual primary responsibility, which is academic instruction, right? And planning lessons and delivering lessons and evaluating and so on and so forth. Which as a as an assistant professor, part of my job is to teach. I can and I teach graduate students who are all highly qualified to be in the program. It's still an extremely difficult, time-consuming task, and to say now we're talking about a teacher who's teaching a child, they're teaching them for 8 hours a day, every day, like, that is an extreme, extreme amount of responsibility, and then you just add in all that other stuff, and so, I think one of the things that would be helpful, and this is a multifaceted issue, we can't simply throwing money at schools and saying get more people wouldn't necessarily be the solution in and of itself, but certainly getting more resources where you have more assistance in a classroom, you have ideally potentially smaller classroom sizes, you have professionals who can help take on the responsibilities of working with the students with heightened level needs or communicating with the family and being able to make sure that it's a collaborative process, all of those things, instead of just going, okay, teacher's supposed to work 40 hours a week, but they're doing, essentially 4 full-time jobs within that period of time. That's not cool and that's not helping the situation.
I think, much like I mentioned before about just people that were more specified or specialized to care for people with like autism or something, I think you should have just teachers with the same qualifications sitting in the same classroom. At least you notice a kid that's standing up doing something, you can at least walk them outside and talk to them and say, "Hey, do you want to like go do something fun?" You can give. But then people will be like, "Well, you're favoriting that one." It's like, well, some people aren't soaking it in. I think one of the things I had was like in 6th grade, they would send you off to a separate class. It's called enrichment, one of those fun words. And you would read, but we didn't really do a lot of reading. I mean, but it's where I came across some of the most interesting topics that I still have of like just fun talking about today: ancient Greek mythology, ancient Rome, ancient folklore and myth. Because we went to the library and the class didn't have its own class. It was 3 students, friends of mine still, that they were very slow readers. I just didn't have the ability to want to read. So like when I could read a Harry Potter book when I was a kid, it was nothing. I could just breeze right through it really fast. But getting me to stay focused was the difficult part. But then you get this teacher that's now teaching 3 students and you had this separation from the class for a little bit. People might have thought you were just a little bit challenged and they put you somewhere else. But that class, you read a book, you got a reward. You're that type of thing. I'm not an incentivized person when it comes to rewards. Like, I don't like that. I think that's cheap. But you end up like, go pick a book out you want to read. It's like, instead of teaching the basic curriculum, and that's how some people are. There's a good amount of people out there that just don't like what's being taught. And obviously you have to teach the basic fundamentals of things too, but to judge them on like they're just a bad student on the basis of they don't want to read what you're, putting out there, is like, that was always a weird thing where I'm hoping that's changing a little bit. Like, I guarantee to you, most kids will probably be interested. If you would have told me about the government stuff when I was a kid, 100% A plus in all of my classes. But you got to learn the basics. But everything else, like Tuck Everlasting, I don't know if you've ever seen that. That was filmed in my town. It was actually my buddy's house. They bought his house, and so that was interesting. So, like, hey, that's where my buddy used to live. And like, that was cool to watch and all that. But no kid's going to want to sit and listen to like all that. So even Shakespeare, they made it fun with the new version, the Romeo and Juliet with the guns. They had the
Yeah,
comedians.
yeah,
That was
yeah.
bad, but it was good, as in it wasn't the basic stuff. And I'm like, that's how we got to do it. There's a lot of kids out there that are probably more than willing to learn things. And it's not that they're just difficult people. They're just not being able to consume in the format that it's also being displayed in.
Yeah, well, part of it is, yeah, making sure that your lessons and what you're targeting is gonna connect with your audience, right? Like, there might be utility in reading certain classic books, and those might be important to for the students to learn. But if you're trying to get students into reading, you probably try to get them engaging with stuff that's gonna connect with them in a different way, right? I mean, a lot of the books, at least when I was in school that we were reading, a lot of the classics, I mean, those had been probably on the curriculum since the 1970s. And, there's some generational differences, right? Like what kids now connect to is going to be different than kids in the 1970s, right? And being aware of those things. And then having the flexibility, and I think teachers, yeah, obviously are doing the best they can, and there are certain requirements that they have to meet, certain content that they have to teach, and I think they try to do their best they can to sort of fit their students' needs within that. You kind of talked about potentially two teachers, depending on the needs of the classroom. A lot of if it's like a heightened needs classroom, they might have paraprofessionals who are there to like pull out the one or two kids that are struggling and give them a little bit more time to do something or to customize something in a way that fits that individual, and that can be really useful, as long as it's not being used indefinitely without fading the supports. Because one of the things that people are concerned about is if I let's say that I struggle in math, and when I get my independent, math time, or maybe it's during math instruction, the paraprofessional or the teaching assistant pulls me off to the side and sort of helps me through that assignment. That's really great, and that's hopefully to help get me back on track. But if that teaching assistant just follows me for the rest of my education and is constantly helping me the entire time, I never learned to do any of it independently, which can be a problem, right? Because the reality is when I graduate, that teaching assistant doesn't follow me for the rest of my life, and I need to be able to do basic math by myself, right? Or at least be able to, you know, enter basic calculations in a calculator, whatever it is that we do that involves math today. I need to be able to do or read, etc. I'm not going to have the teaching assistant following me around, helping me sound out words for the rest of my life. I need to be able to read.
It
Uh,
was helpful when they would like you'd read the question to them. Like, I don't get this one. You'd read the question out, and then when they're reading the answers, they would do like a doggy voice when they hit the right one. Like, is it A or is it B or is it C? And they would do that. And you're like, oh, okay, it's gotta be C. Hey, help me with the next one real quick. And then it's just but I got one last question for you, and that is, how difficult is this with the transfer to online school? A lot of kids that are doing this online learning aspect of things since COVID. I know some schools that have went back full time, but I also know some schools that went back full time that also allow their students to do this online learning thing. And I mean, it's like going to college online. It's you get your degree, but Man, I did some of my classes online, but then I had to go in person. I was like, okay, I got to do all of them in person because this is a way different experience. I know it might be just sitting in a class and it's hard to do sometimes than, filling out a test in your underwear, but it's a different learning process. You're soaking in more.
Yeah. So I think there are pros and cons to online instruction, online classes, whether we talk about sort of, K through 12 or even in college. There are also significant downsides to it. And for the students who have heightened level needs, the downsides to online education can be even worse, right? So if you're a student who is struggling with, let's say, reading and keeping up with that, depending on how that online class is set up, it might be much more difficult for the teacher to identify that issue quickly and to intervene in an efficient way, right? So a lot of times, you know, especially the students that I ended up sort of working with consulting on, the reality is, the class would be going on virtually, and essentially the parent is having to act as that teacher assistant and essentially teach the kid the information, which is not an ideal arrangement for the parent, of course, because they're having to be busy. The the reality is, whenever you're helping a student, your goal is to work yourself out of a job. If I have a student who's struggling and I'm trying to help them through learning to read, my goal is to, in the most efficient manner possible, go from helping them, whether that's sort of giving them little hints like you were sort of referring to, until I am like completely worked out of that situation and they're reading independently at grade level, which is a difficult task. But, theoretically, teaching aides they're trained to do that, or they can be given instruction to do it. Parents don't necessarily know how to do that, and so you'll see the potential for more reliance on that assistance and those reminders and those hints and things like that, and that's not gonna be good for someone long term. We need people to be as independent and as autonomous as possible, within whatever setting that they're sort of operating in. So in school, the ideal arrangement is that they're able to independently participate in all of their classroom activities, all instruction, all assignments, et cetera, and they're able to do that independently. Some people need a little bit more help, right? And so we're going to step in, we're going to give them some supports, but we need to get those supports out of there as quickly as possible so they don't become completely dependent and reliant on them, which will ultimately reduce the skills that they're able to acquire and probably have, unfortunate long-term side effects on the quality of their life.
Unless they start a podcast and talk to a bunch of people from around the world. But no, Dr. Morris, seriously, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. Can you please tell people where they can find you? Also, where your podcast is located as well, too.
Sure. Yeah. So the podcast is Behavior Analysis and Practice, the podcast. If you search that in any of the major podcast players, Spotify, Apple, whatever, you'll find it. If you're interested in the work that I do, the easiest way to sort of find me and follow me is just on LinkedIn if you have that. So just Cody Morris, uh, PhD, BCBAD, or sort of my credentials at the end of my name there that you can search and find me. I post my articles and stuff like that on that page. And yeah, otherwise people can find my Salve Regina University profile if they have like individual questions, and they can email me through that mechanism.
And I'll make sure I link it all in the description, man. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.